reading some excerpts.
Sorry.
That's all right. Reading some excerpts from my story, my book. And the last is, and I hope vigorously you will ask all sorts of questions, whether related to the book or not, I don't care. But before I do that, I want to dedicate today's event to two people who are very dear to me, and they are Avery and Irene Dieter, or as I know them as Prope and Rini. And these are people who live in the hamlet of Ancramdale, where Sheila and I live. And they are the most hospitable people that I've ever met. Some 30 years ago, or close to it, I met them at Farmer's Wife, that some of you may know. Farmer's Wife is a cafe and also a catering place that I would frequent almost daily when I am up here. And it's also sort of an extension, I think, of Prope and Rini's living room. And Prope would regale me with stories of when he was postmaster in our hamlet and about baseball, and most notably, when it came to his military service in Korea. And at the same time, Rini would sparkle up the room, especially with her holiday earrings. She would wear different earrings representing different holidays. And she has the most dry, modest sense of humor that nevertheless fills the room with her warmth and insights. So again, these are two people very dear to me, and I just want to say hello to them. Okay, so I was born in July of 1942, and at the time of my birth, the Nazis already occupied Holland for over 2 years. In fact, when they came in May of 1940, they rolled over the Dutch military in something like 5 days. The Dutch had been neutral in World War I and were just not a challenge to the mighty Nazi machine. And within those 5 days, the Queen, her family, and an entourage fled to England. And it's from England on Radio Oranje. Oranje means orange, and it's the symbol of the Dutch royal family color. She would broadcast, Queen Wilhelmina would broadcast to the nation of 8 million people, the Dutch people, to be vigilant and be resistant to the best of their abilities in fighting on whatever level they could against the Nazi regime. Now, interestingly, Hitler saw as racially similar, and as a result, he did not send a major military force there. In fact, Holland was essentially administered by 1,000 civilians and SS officers. Now, they did have the help of a right-wing Dutch party called the NSB, a party that was the second largest in Western Europe outside of Austria, having some 100,000 members. In addition to that organization, there were many informers, bounty hunters, and they did a lot of the dirty work that the Nazis either didn't do as much of, or in any case needed help with. The Nazis at the time of my birth were still very careful very calculating in terms of showing their bare knuckles. And so it wasn't until about, and I should interject that yes, there were nightly raids, hundreds of people would disappear and people would just whisper. But within 4 months, their nefarious plan was in full display. The final solution, the plan to kill, to exterminate all Jews, their culture, and most notably the young, was truly in process. Trains would leave the primary cities in Holland every Tuesday, packed to the gills. They were off to a transition camp called Westerbork. And at Westerbork, they were categorized and documented. And within days or weeks thereafter, they were then sent on cattle cars further east to all the brand name death camps that you probably read about. The unfortunate part about Holland being administered by a civilian order rather than the military was shown by the fact that they were so effective in killing Jews. For example, out of 140,000 Jews that had amassed at the beginning of the war, 110,000 were sent to these camps through Westerbork, and only 5,000 survived and returned at war's end. At the same time, 25,000 went into hiding, whether physically went into hiding or had false identities. And there, I guess the rate was not as successful because 17,000 survived the war and resurfaced. And I was one of them. Of course, I feel blessed about that. So what I'd like to do now is show the video, but before I do, I just want to give you a few details about it. It was done through the auspices of the Ankrum Opera House, the Ankrum Center for the Arts in essence, and it's a program called Real People, Real Stories. And last August, I was fortunate enough to be part of a 1-hour program. There were 4 storytellers. And the video is a summary of the book. And it, in essence, details on a brief level my first 55 years. So Tammy, whenever you get the chance, why don't we see the video? It's about 15 minutes long.
No. So up next, a storyteller from Ankrum, and he's telling a story about the impact of war on a toddler hidden during World War II in the Netherlands. Please welcome to the stage, Joe Gosler.
Greetings. It was 1975, and I lived on the Lower East Side in a tenement flat above a bar. And I couldn't sleep that night. And finally I did. And suddenly I was just brutally awakened to the sound of music, loud music. And it got louder still, so much so that the floor and walls began to vibrate. And then it went from there. But suddenly I heard someone yelling, "Last dance." And I couldn't fall asleep after that. In fact, I barely slept for 9 months thereafter. But it wasn't just the music. Inside of me, there were tidal waves of anxiety washing over every pore and crevice of my body. I was born in 1942 in the Netherlands during World War II, and I'm Jewish. And at the age of 7 months, my parents decided it's best to place me in hiding. And so a nursing student arrives from the Dutch resistance, and she bundles me up, and we vanish into the night. My parents go into hiding as well with false identities. They move to the countryside until they are caught and beaten severely. And then my father is shipped to a transition camp called Westerbork. And my mother, who was blue-eyed and fair-skinned, was threatened and basically told that if she ever associated with Jews again, she would be killed. In contrast, I was placed at a family whose name is Dijkstra, Moeder and Vader Dijkstra. And this is a Protestant family with 2 young daughters named Anneke and Foley. And they loved me. They cared for me. They nurtured me. And I bonded with them. And this was the only family I truly knew. The war ends. I'm 3 years old. My parents, after a frantic search, find me. But who were these strangers who called themselves my parents? I was totally uprooted, confused, angry, and I promptly burned the bathroom curtains. And then I wander off from time to time in search of my real parents. This goes on for a while. Later on, in 45, my sister is born. And a few weeks after that, my parents bring home a puppy, and we name him Whitey. And Whitey and me were like that. I just loved the dog. He was not only my playmate, he protected me. And he gave me the nurturing that my parents couldn't. In 1949, the war recession was still raging, and my parents could no longer tolerate the nightmares that they had. And so we go to Israel. But I couldn't take Whitey with me or my neighborhood. In Israel, we're placed in a kibbutz called Bet Ashita, and on the kibbutz, the children lived separately in a dorm. And that was a blessing to me because I was still very much in turmoil. I needed the distance from my parents at that time. And I was the Dutch boy. I was the outsider. And I got into a lot of fights. And I never wanted to tell my parents about that because I never wanted them to ever worry again. But one evening, when I was invited to dinner at their house, my father noticed the bruises on my face and he said, "What happened to you, son?" And I said very quickly, "Oh, I fell into a hole." And he said equally quickly, "Well, next time carry a big stick with you." And within months thereafter, some of the very kids that I had fights with became my friends. And slowly but surely, I really folded into the rhythm of that community. I was recognized. I was part of it, and I loved it. And my father loved it too, as did my sister. But my mother was absolutely outraged because she had to share her children with that larger community, especially her son. And so 4 years later, we are bound for America, but we first stay at temporary housing where my uncle finds a litter of fox terrier dogs under his bungalow. And he gives us one, and we promptly call her Gura. And Gura and I were inseparable. Wherever I went, she would follow. And on the last day, when we took the bus that would take us to the ship and to America, I'm sitting in the back of the bus and I look through the rear window and I see her running the bus as long as she could. It was 1953 and I'm 11 and we're in Rockaway Park at a house where other aunts and uncles stayed before us. And my father gets a job in the garment industry and my mother begins to clean homes. And I start picking empty bottles off the beach. And in that process, I saw all of the happiness on the faces of people. And the more I saw that, the more alone I felt. And I longed to be back in Israel. 2 years after that, we move again. And I realized that each time we move, the old emotional scars are peeled open again, and new wounds are forming. And on this occasion, my father got a job as a supervisor at a large chicken farm in Monticello, New York. And so we moved. A couple of years later, I finally clicked the social scene I'm involved, and I actually excel in sports, and so I become somewhat popular. And my parents insist at that very moment, I think you need to start helping in the house. And so I got a job after school, and my self-esteem vanished. At the same time, we get a letter from Holland that Muda Dijkstra died. Now, I had not been directly in contact with her for 10 years, but I was overwhelmed with grief. And no matter what my parents tried to do, they couldn't console me. A few years after that, I graduate, I'm 18, and we move again. We're moving to Queens to the very same house. And the reason was that we wanted to be nearer, my parents wanted to be nearer to our extended family. And I saw this as a great opportunity to leave the house, finally. But my parents had other thoughts, and I continued to contribute half of my salary for another half dozen years. But at 21, I bolted out of the house and moved in with my cousin Andy. And he introduced me to a world, an avant-garde world that I never knew existed. And I stopped working immediately and only worked sporadically for the next 12 years. And I started performing with the Bread and Puppet Theater. I'm in all of the anti-war marchers and picket lines, and I travel extensively, dabble in drugs. I'm flying, literally. And I knew this was a time to actually begin focusing on myself, but I really couldn't do it at that moment in my life. I needed to be unburdened and free. And so thereafter, I meet Sheila, my future wife, and we start dating, and eventually we started living together and decided that we should go on a big trip. So a year goes by and we amass $5,000, and we buy 2 round-trip tickets that were good for a year, some camping gear, and we're off to Europe, to Holland in particular, because my parents in the interim moved back to Holland. And we stay with them for a while, but then we hitch our way to Morocco because there's a hippie colony near a fishing village along the Atlantic. And I truly felt on top of the moment. 9 months later, we returned to the States, continue our lives, but Sheila is getting more serious about her future. I resist all of that. I just want to continue flying on my magic carpet. 2 years go by, and we're visiting my parents in Amsterdam, and we're crossing the street. And I extend my arm to my mother and say, hey, why don't you grab that as we cross? And she pushes my arm away and says, I don't need you. I can cross the road by myself. And for some reason, it just rips me apart. And it really sends me in a downward spiral. It's 1975, and I live on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in a tenement flat above a bar, and I can't sleep for fear that I would not wake up. When I ate, I worried about gagging. I was totally vulnerable, and I felt everything on a visceral level. My sister and Sheila encouraged me to go into therapy. I distrusted therapy as I distrusted so many things, but I do it for them. I go into therapy, and I'm in therapy for 8 months or so, and one of the people in it suddenly yells at me, "Stop wasting my time." Well, I was totally embarrassed, but it was a wake-up call. And things started to percolate. I got involved, and I started to localize my feelings. For the first time, I was able to focus anger at my parents. You see, until that time, I rationalized why they had to give me away. They needed to give me away for my safety as well as theirs. Now, I could actually feel that sense of abandonment. I could feel depression. I could feel love. And I was able to share that feeling of love with Sheila in a different way than ever before. And it suddenly dawned on me that I was able to put my past into perspective. It no longer overwhelmed me. And I was convinced that I could change. So soon thereafter, I trimmed my hair. It was quite long, and I had a wild mustache, and I shaved that off and got an adult job working at a preschool as a business manager. And 3 years later, in 1980, I became an American citizen, and in fact, welcomed my parents back to live in the States, which they did it. And then found a defining job of my career, which was working as the business manager of Friends Seminary, a Quaker independent school in Lower Manhattan. And I loved the collegiality of that place and totally admired their Quaker underpinnings. A few months after that, our son Jake was born. And a couple of years after that, Sheila and I founded a school, a preschool called Beginnings Nursery. And Jake, in fact, started attending Friends. And so suddenly I became aware of the fact that all that was meaningful to me, my family, my work, was within a 1-block radius, a small village, if you will. And I realized I was no longer fragmented and was becoming whole. About 15 years ago, I retired from Friends, and the first thing that we did was get a dog. And the dog's name, we named him Milton. And it was the most precious time that I had with him for 11 years. And he died staring into my eyes. Today, I write. I'm involved in some Quaker projects. I love to cook as well as eat and garden. But most importantly, I walk our new dog, Reuben. Thank you.
Okay.
The two is it after his name? Joe Gosler. Who's Joe Gosler? Second?
Yeah, I know.
No?
No, I don't know what that.
Oh.
Okay. War is an exaggeration of who we are and what we're capable of. Because I was born during the war, there was no before, no time to breathe, to inhale what other children did during peacetime. Though my first 3 years of life were in hiding, they were pleasant ones, with love, nourishment, and playfulness. But at war's end, I was ripped away from the only family I knew and loved, and returned to my birth family. This is, in many ways, where my story begins. I felt abandoned, confused, and angry. Now what I would like to do is read some various excerpts from the book. And there will be plenty of time, as I mentioned before, at the end, where I expect some questions. Anyway, this is the prologue of the book. I actually wrote this well before I wrote the memoir. I wrote this about 30 years ago for an assembly at Friends Seminary. And it's about cobblestones, because the inner cities of most European countries still have them. And they were always very important to me on many different levels. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The streets built for horse and buggy travel did not support modern times. The advent of the automobile and airplane were symbols of this new age. The thick mist of the 1930s was lifting, and with the Depression fading, new hopes and new political roots were becoming more entrenched. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The air was mired with optimism. Children played in the streets while their parents rushed off to work. Very few people took the time to look beyond their own gardens. If they did, they disassociated themselves from what they saw and heard. The rise of Nazi power was evident everywhere. Shops vandalized, books burned, cemeteries and places of worship desecrated, people beaten in the street. Few questioned these onslaughts against the Jews, feeling, why should we care? They are not like us. There was a myopic sense of trust and belief that things would work out, that this too would pass. They wished for a future that was well managed, orderly, with a single culture and political vision, a vision that excluded me. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The traffic in the streets was now a mixture of people rushing everywhere, a few automobiles and many trucks, soldiers, and tanks. At dusk, people would come home from work with their groceries, listen to the radio, and because of curfews, rarely went out at night. Many Jews went into hiding. They hid wherever they could, in closets, attics, haylofts, and forests, or they obtained false identity papers and blended in. The Nazi group was everywhere, and you could not trust anyone. Mistakes were fatal. cobblestones were washed away each morning. The parade of Nazi boots is gone. The war ended. The trucks and tanks are gone, and people rush into the streets to celebrate and forget. They stand on the souls of the dead. Now I would like to read, many of these are truly snippets, but shorter than the prologue. That was done on purpose so that you folks don't get bored. So this is when I went into hiding, and it was mentioned in the video, but it's a little bit more in detail. At 7 months or 8 months old, at an age when an infant can barely see beyond his mother's breast, I was taken from my parents by the Dutch resistance to places unknown. One evening in March of 1943, a nursing student on a bicycle with a straw basket attached came to our house, bundled me in a blanket, placed me in the basket, and pedaled off into the darkness. Much later in my life, my parents recounted their feelings of being in a state of controlled fear and numbness, full of remorse, and yet relieved. They hoped I would be safe, although there was no guarantee that they would ever see me again. So this excerpt is when I was already in hiding. In fact, I was 2.5 years old, and it's really my first haircut experience. I'm told that I was 2 years old when slowly but determinedly I walked to town with Father. We were going to the barbershop, and I was excited about my first haircut, although I grimaced with fear when the barber approached. He was going to cut my hair, which after all was part of my body. But when the first curls fell, like feathers drifting to the floor, I relaxed and enjoyed the sensation until the rumbling sounds of tanks rolling over uneven cobblestones made me jerk my head to see what was happening outside. The smells and sounds of diesel-fed trucks and the rhythmic thud of leather boots made everyone in the shop turn towards the street. Suddenly I yelled, "Rotmuffin!" Hands came flying from every direction to cup my mouth and drag me to the back room. I was innocently mimicking what Moodle and Father said in the quiet of their home about the occupiers when they marched past our home. The men in the barber shop were much relieved when the parade of helmets and leather boots marched on in their robot-like rhythm without coming to a halt. Yelling "rotten Nazis," even by a child of 2, could mean death. So 3 years later, in 1945, war ends, and my parents go through a frantic search, and it took some time before, in fact, my parents were reunited. My father was in this transition camp where, luckily, he was a slave laborer. He worked 16 hours a day doing all sorts of normal but horrible things like digging graves. But because of that, he was never shipped further east to the concentration camps, and therefore his life was spared. But he had lost some 35 pounds. He was not a very tall man. In fact, he was maybe 5'1", and he pedaled his way back to my mother in Amsterdam on a wooden spoke bicycle. and looked gaunt and was in terrible shape. And then they looked for me, and that took a little bit longer, but thankfully, the Dutch keep very good records. This is partly what their stereotype is. And so they were able to find me. Nearly 3 years had passed. The infant they remembered had not only physically changed, but emotionally and psychologically had wrapped himself in the arms of the Dijkstra family. My parents were strangers. I did not recognize them and wanted to return to moeder and vader. At age 3, I was confused and angered by the loss of my underground family. I do know that many years later, when I began to thaw and connect with the swirl of emotions that welled within me, that my subterraneous outbursts, which surfaced without warning, were fueled by a deep sense of abandonment. We were back together again, but each member was irrevocably damaged by the experience of war. We returned to Groningen. My parents were devastated by the loss of their family, parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins. They also lost their homes, jobs, careers, friends, and more importantly, their spirit. Every street had a story to tell. If the cobblestones could talk, you would hear the screams, moans, and whispers of those who remained and those who were taken away. Every day was consumed with painful memories. My parents were in an endless state of mourning. They seemed to have aged well beyond their years. At 3 years old, I was still wrapped in innocence, but cracks were beginning to form in my porcelain psyche. Although reunited with my biological parents, I felt abandoned by the only family I had known. I cried for moeder. I was angry, anxious, and confused. I trusted no one. In 1949, as was noted in the video, we went to Israel, and we actually at first wanted to come to the US, but there was such a long waiting time, and we didn't have a host, and you needed a host. So instead we went to Israel. Israel came into being the year before and needed as many people as they could get, and they welcomed us with open arms. And so we arrived at this placement camp, and we stayed there for about 4 months. We were told where we should live. In those days, unless you knew someone with some authority, you couldn't just live anywhere. You were placed in different places. And we were placed in this kibbutz called Bet Hashita. It was a secular kibbutz. There were many religious kibbutzim, and it was what they call a mapam kibbutz, or left-wing sort of social democratic type of kibbutz. And in the beginning, I was the outsider, as I was in every community that I experienced thereafter. And I was the Dutch boy, and I would get into these horrible fights, some of which I noted in the video. And it probably took me about 8-9 months, during which time it was very much a struggle. And if it wasn't for another librarian like Tammy, although this person's name was Beersheba, my life would have been rougher still. But 8 or 9 months after I arrived in this kibbutz, I began to speak Hebrew fluently, and I got into the rhythm of the place, and things started to change, and they actually became wonderful. A series of adventures followed, one more exciting than the next. With a gaggle of friends, I explored the many caves nearby. The caves held mysteries, darkness, thick spider webs, odd-shaped bones, slimy walls, moss, and strange sounds. Scared off by some noises or movement, we rushed down the hills like mountain goats, feet barely touching the ground, zigzagging past gravelly stones, clusters of irises and poppies, tufts of grass, and an assortment of bramble bushes. At times, we imagined ourselves to be Maccabees, an ancient Hebraic army fighting the evil forces that threatened us. Our mighty wooden swords and homemade bows and arrows overwhelmed our mock enemies in our quixotic play. Each adventure and activity created favorable experiences and memories, and like a montage, produced fluidity and wholesomeness. Finally, I felt I belonged. I was fully engaged in the fabric of everyday life. My fondest memories of that time were the holidays. I loved Purim, when my sister was dressed as Queen Esther and I was dressed and danced as a Cossack. Sukkot, the harvest festival, was my favorite. The sukkah and the communal feasts that were prepared were unforgettable. Building my first sukkah from strong wooden branches, 2 inches thick, evenly staked into the earth, 2 feet apart, was not just a collaborative effort, but symbolically a recognition of my own personal harvest. The sukkah was shaped into a rectangular pattern, and we wove young sapling branches horizontally in and out between every other vertical branch, creating secure walls on 3 sides. Patches of sky showed between the roof branches, and clusters of grapes and thin branches laden with green olives were hung on the interior walls. On a rough wooden table lay baskets of carrots, potatoes, cabbages, leeks, and melons. The cacophony of sounds, the buzzing of bees and flies, the croaking of frogs, and the distant high-pitched howls of jackals blended with the pungent perfume of fresh ripened fruits and vegetables. All this, under a canopy of stars, created a bacchanal for the senses that transported me to a place of peace and wonderment. So the next 2 excerpts are an expression of the kind of alienation that not only I felt, but I guess my father felt at different points as well. And this first one is on the chicken farm where we lived in Monticello, New York. And we lived in the main house, which had a certain powerful suggestion built into it, but there were also trailers in the back. The trailers housed workers and day laborers. These people were rarely integrated into the social hub of the farm. They were usually poor white or black men who lived by themselves and were paid in the form of cash and/or groceries. There was a sense of transience about their lives, and they remained on the periphery like semi-domesticated dogs, never to be understood or trusted. Little did I realize that their experience mirrored my own marginalization. I never felt a sense of belonging. My life was as transient as theirs, acknowledging the similarities was too painful, and I desperately identified with the owners of the chicken farm. The next one deals with the fact, it's almost Freudian, that although I lived on my own at the time, I was in my mid-20s, lived on the Lower East Side already. But for certain mundane tasks, such as going to a dentist or even getting a haircut, I still went back to my parents' neighborhood. And I'm sure it had indirectly something to do that the emotional umbilical cord wasn't severed yet and should have been. In any case, I'm coming out of the subway after my haircut, and I'm walking towards my parents' house for dinner there. As I neared the 3-story apartment building, I looked back towards the subway station and was surprised to see my father jogging in my direction. At first, I thought he was simply trying to catch up with me. But as he came closer, I could see that his face was creased with anxiety and alienation. My father was running home, away from his daily hell. I crossed the street to avoid any awkwardness or embarrassment as he ran by, fear etched on his face. I arrived at the apartment a calculated 5 minutes later, and my father welcomed me with his warm brown eyes as though nothing had transpired. The transformation confounded me, but I easily understood the stress he felt in the outside world and the need to hide it from himself and from me. So my experience with large organizations is very biased in the sense that I don't trust large organizations. Wherever possible, I try to keep things very local. Not only because there's a mutualism there that I understand and covet between people who know me and people who I know. And this is true of religion as well, institutionalized religion. And so, for example, I have never been a member of the synagogue or any large organism like that. But I'm very spiritual. And so this is a segment about that. Whether it was because we had a son and a family, or the impact of my father's death, or the ongoing resentment I felt towards God and organized religion, our spiritual needs became more important, and we became more attentive to the recognition and celebration of certain Jewish holidays. Spirituality, for me, is a feeling of sharing, of respect, and a way of connecting. It is an oceanic feeling, and it lives in my heart and mind. Rosh Hashanah, Hanukkah, Pesach, and the secular Thanksgiving became holidays that brought the inner sanctum together. Maria, her children, and eventually their respective spouses and children, Oma or grandmother, Sheila's sister, Andrea, close friends, and sometimes cousin Jack and Lucy would attend. For Sheila and me, this was a true blessing because we observed these holidays from the center of our family home rather than from a pew in a synagogue. We enjoyed the days of cooking, the various rituals, the dancing and singing while washing dishes after the meal, and a personalized Haggadah developed and illustrated by Sheila. proudly saw ourselves as ritual weavers. And as time went by, through mutual agreement, we parceled Hanukkah off to Stephen and Brenda, and from time to time would celebrate July 4th and other holidays elsewhere. It did not matter to us where it was held, just simply that the family looked forward to it and that it happened each year. Satisfaction derived from bringing family and friends together for any purpose with good food and drink fed all the crevices of my being. Playing the role of the patriarch fulfilled me both as a man and as a father. Whether people viewed me that way or not didn't matter. In contrast to my father, I always wanted to play a central role in the family. And although Bet Hashita was a secular kibbutz, I remembered the pleasure I felt when participating in the Sukkot and Hanukkah festivals. We provided continuity and a sense of belonging to our gathered family. I thought a lot about my past, my childhood, my erratic travels, contempt for organized religion, my reverence for life, and reaffirmed to myself what was truly important. How I conducted myself daily would be the hallmark of my religion. The last excerpt I'd like to read to you coincided with when I retired the last year of my employment at Friends. And it was a jubilant year because I really coasted, you know. I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. And by that time, I had lost all ambition. And so what does that leave you? It leaves you with the raw stresses of your job. You see, ambition has a way of balancing that out because there's something in the future, something you want that's there that buttresses all the raw tension-making stuff. In any case, so this was a jubilant year, but at the same time, and I never know if it's by coincidence or by some plan, 4 very important people in my life, 4 women, my mother, Sheila's mother, and 2 aunts of mine, Tante Celine and Tante Rosette, died within a 1-year period. And these were truly the matriarchs of various family sections. The passing of these matriarchs created a subtle ripple effect on all the remaining family members. Years before, their children, essentially a group of cousins, took on the responsibility of marking and celebrating the various religious holidays and familial traditions. But now we understood soberly that our parents were no longer the custodians of the past. There was a subtle shift, like a continental drift, that made me, Maria, Sheila, Marion, Jimmy, and Jack the new elders and the keepers of family memory. When the matriarchs died, we became the old ones, and like an heirloom hidden in a precious wooden chest, that reverence was transferred to us. The role of the elder is familiar to me. In fact, in some ways, I've been old since childhood. It is neither a badge of honor nor something to be known. It just is. So this completes the excerpts. And now what I would like to do is open it up to any questions, either from people on Zoom or, of course, all of you here. Yes.
Yeah. How was the meeting with the family that had you and your parents? What was that like? I mean, how was that?
After the war, you mean?
Yeah,
Well, that's an interesting question because in fact, there were all sorts of stories on so many fronts, and I'm sure you know them, Sharon, where families would get into fights with the very people, usually Christian families, who had their child, because the Christian family got so involved with that youngster that they didn't want to give him up. And nor did the young child, not knowing any better, want to leave. Now, whether, I'm sure they were not happy to, but the people, the Dijkstra family, Moeder and Vader, probably reluctantly, but knew what they needed to do. And they handed me over to my parents. My parents had no idea who the people were and where they lived. Ironically, they lived all of 40 kilometers away in Gelderland, the southeast province, an agricultural province outside of Amsterdam. I lived in a town called Wageningen near the Rhine River. And so the family gave me up, but my parents smartly continued a correspondence out of thankfulness, if only that, but out of a continuity that was important for them at first, and later, of course, for me as well, because even today, although not only obviously are the parents dead, but even a very important, both children of that family, of the Dijkstra family, have died. One died early in, I think, the late 1960s of leukemia. She was the younger daughter. The older daughter, Anneke, died a few years ago, and she was about 89. And we not only kept a correspondence with her, but we often would visit her place and her children as she would visit us and vacation with us. So there was an ongoing bond like that. Yes, anyone else? Yeah.
I noticed you're wearing the same tie that you wore in the video.
Actually, it's not the same one, it's a different one. But this,
Is there significance to that?
I love polos, all right? But today, it actually, and I'm not sure if Pro, who I talked about, is still on, but he loves bolos too. So it is sort of in recognition of Pro and Rini, if they're there, that I'm wearing a bolo.
and who
Yeah.
are Prop and Rini?
What?
Who are Prop and Rini?
Probe and Rini are two wonderful people who live in Ancrumdale.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
you mentioned.
I
it, right.
mentioned it earlier. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious, did you ever get bar mitzvah?
Hmm,
Or your son,
very
or your
interesting.
wife?
Very interesting question in light of the fact that I never belonged to a synagogue. You know, when I came to this country, I was 11, and by the time I was 12 plus, I spoke English relatively well, and actually was also still fluent in Hebrew. Today I know a few words because we never continued speaking it at home. And this aunt of mine, who was our host, since we needed a host, as I mentioned, she actually was nice enough to foot the bill for the bar mitzvah classes and what would have been a bar mitzvah. And I should add that in a very obnoxious way, I would correct the rabbi because I spoke Hebrew fluently and I didn't like his accent, and it was quite naughty of me. But anyway, my mother got into a fight with my aunt, Tante Rose. And as fights happen within families, people become somewhat spiteful. And so Tante Rose withdrew her offer of footing the bill. And my parents were not religious. They weren't religious before the war. In fact, in many ways, Sheila and I are much more directly involved with Passover, Pesach, or any of the Jewish holidays than my parents ever were. Maybe they would make a meal that was somewhat representative of what one has during the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, or something like that. So it didn't happen, and I was not bar mitzvahed, and I was mostly disappointed as a 12-year-old that I was not going to get this suit of clothing, which would have been my first symbol of an adult, wearing a suit. And I didn't get that. And to be honest, I never missed it. And as to the other part, as it relates to my son, what we did, and he will call it, my son even today will call it a fake bar mitzvah. The word fake is overused, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, he calls it that because he was never bar mitzvahed in the traditional way. He never learned the Torah. He never spent time with a tutor or rabbi to learn Hebrew. What we instead did, we had a ceremony in our house, and we each read a speech that was of importance to us. And I recall his speech had to do with, I think he turned 13 in 1993, and I think it had to do with the Croatia war in the 90s, and how upset he was by it. And we all said some wonderful things. There were people crying, a lot of people there, lots of good food. We planted a tree here in our place upstate. We played baseball, and there was a rainbow. So from my point of view, it was a very successful bar mitzvah, and it certainly is nestled comfortably in my heart. Anyone else?
Joe, there's a couple of questions on Zoom as well.
Sure, you want to?
Sure. Cordula asks, she wonders what your feelings are now towards the Dutch collaborators.
That's interesting. There were many Dutch collaborators. There were many people who hid Jews as well. But as with Anne Frank, there was an informer at the end that ratted them out. Right now, today, I don't have any ill feelings towards anyone. Quite honestly, I let go of that a long time ago. I recall when I first went back to Europe in 1963, I was 21, and I was traveling with my cousin Andy, and we first hitchhiked through Germany. And it was fascinating to see the division between the young and old. We stayed at a university, the University of Münster in the north, and how embarrassed young people were by what their parents were complicit with. And the older people I spoke to, on the other hand, didn't feel any guilt. In many cases, they were proud. They will tell you they didn't know any better. And in some ways, I trust that. Sadly, But the average person just follows the guidelines in front of him or her and is not, and doesn't make things more complicated and messy, which to me is where you find the richness in life, but that's a whole other story. So I just, a long time ago, made up my mind, I was not going to hold those feelings because it would be such a weight to feel that kind of anger. I'll use another example. When I first heard about the Ukrainian war, I said to myself, good for them. The Ukrainians harbored some horrible anti-Semitic people during World War II. And so my first impression was, that's too bad, but that's how it goes. And then I started looking at the refugees, the people who lost their homes, the millions of people who are now living away in Poland and other places, or were forced to go to Russia, as there are. And my heart opened up because of the horribleness of what happens during war. I mean, most people want the same things. They want safety, nourishment, and a future. It's so simple. You know, we're not very different from one another. And when we are, we need to learn to tolerate that. So to answer you, Cordula, I really don't harbor any hard feelings towards the Germans or the informers. Now, having said all of that, and being streetwise, my eyes are always open. I would have been a great point guard because I can always see laterally what's happening around me. And that is conditioning. That is a vigilance, Cordula, that I know you fully understand.
And Carol Samar has her hand up. Carol, do you want to ask your question?
Carol.
Hi, Joe. What a strong, strong story. Thank you. Thank you. I know that you have been active with some Quaker projects, and I'm aware of the strength that you bring to those projects. But I'm wondering about your story, your strong story. I'm wondering about the kids that are in Friends Seminary now. Do you have any plans to perhaps share your story with some of the current people at Friends?
Well, the interesting thing is, Carol, and thank you for raising that, I have had several assemblies, the last one being, maybe 15 years ago, 18 years ago. If my book was not written at that point, I did write a short a synopsis of my wartime experience. But so I've had a couple of assemblies there. And over the years, I have spoken in different schools. I think the age level that I enjoy speaking to most are middle schools, because they're not yet fully cut off in a way into their own little zones. There is a foundation of sincerity that and a definite level of development and intelligence that makes them still curious. So I have spoken to a variety of different groups, social work groups, and mostly schools. But at Friends, we'll see what happens. You know, I have written some things that person in the alumni office at Friends has promoted. So on that level, yes. Basically, my story is different, certainly, but it's a single story. We each have a story to tell, at least one, and we should try our darnest to broadcast it wherever we can. So in terms of myself, I certainly will continue to speak in various environments, depending on who invites me and whether I have the time. Thanks, Carol.
Speaking to middle school sounds perfect. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. See ya.
And we have one more question in chat from Stacy Rosen, who says she remembers the visit of a Holocaust survivor from the Elie Wiesel Center who came to Friends and told her story of living in the camps to the students. As there are fewer and fewer survivors of the Holocaust, do you feel a need to tell your story as it relates to the Holocaust?
Yes, but not only because of that particular event, because sadly, I think there have been other Holocausts as well. I think what makes the Holocaust that we identify with the 40s and Nazism, what makes it different is the breadth and the planning of killing. It was such a phenomenally thought out process. Having this state mandated plan was done on a level that was never done before. Yes, there have been millions of people killed before in Africa, in more recently in Syria or Syria, and all these places. But it was never as efficiently, effectively, machine-like done. And that's in some ways made it even more horrible. But in fact, sadly, there will be other Holocausts to come. And that's the sad part. We always have to keep our eyes open and do more than that wherever we can, whether it is on a political level, in terms of voting, in terms of resisting, because quite honestly, what's currently happening in the Ukraine may have a ripple effect and could sadly impact Europe. On the other hand, what's happening in our country, the division we have between the South and the North in a simplistic term. I mean, we're on the verge of something much larger, sadly, than we've seen in many, many years. And I'm not suggesting that we will have what looks like the old Civil War, but you could easily come to a place where more and more federal buildings, as the one in Oklahoma in the 90s exploding, many more things like that can happen right here. And we have to be vigilant and do whatever we can so that, in fact, this does not happen. But, and the irony of this, from my point of view, is that in countries where there is a clear tyrant ruling the country, or where there's almost a pure democracy, as in Switzerland, we are sort of mixed. We're kind of in the middle. Yes, we have democratic, features, but we're not up there if you compare us to Switzerland and their manner of democracy. Well, it seems that when you have these extremes, either a highly democratic country or a highly repressive tyrant type of country, civil wars do not happen there. They happen in that space where there is a mixture, where there is some democratic features, and yet there's a lot of oligarchical waves of policies and shifts, call them lobbyists or whatever. The voices in Washington don't necessarily represent who we are here on the street. And I say that without talking in left-wing or right-wing manner. It just is, and that's a sad statement. Any other questions from Zoom?
Just from Zoom, just a comment from Renee and thanking you for your presentation. Saying they miss you with the farmer's wife.
Any other questions? Yes?
Where do you buy the book? Oh, sorry.
Where what?
Can you buy the book?
After the program finishes, if some people would like to buy the book, I brought books.
Oh, okay.
And I can sign books, so
Okay.
we could do all that shortly. I also have some beverages here if people would like some. Yes?
Well, one thing I want to say was your accent, there's very little European accent.
That's by plan. No, really. I think, I've thought about it for a long time. I think as a hidden child, I had remained hidden on different levels for a number of years, well into my adulthood. And one of them, I did not want to have any vestigial remain that would identify me as being this or that. To be, on some levels, invisible allows you a mobility that is important, or at least it's important to me. Even today, when I sit in a restaurant, I'll sit facing the door. I need to know who's coming in. It has laced my genes in that manner, Yeah.
I didn't hear anything about, you say you're against organized religion, or?
For me, it doesn't work. I see.
Because it didn't sound like you had very much of it anyway.
I didn't, but I'm aware of how it operates. And it's a social political environment, and it doesn't work for me. And in general, large organisms like that don't work for me anyway, because I don't see my reflection within them. And I'm egocentric enough to want to see my own reflection.
I was
Yes?
just going to make the comment that my parents felt very similar about organized religion. And the only religious training that I had for 3 years was from the seminary, Sunday school, which was something that my parents were from a very Quaker town in Indiana. That was where we went.
Well, to worship in silence within the meeting house is a gift to anyone who wants to be there. It's an absolute gift. Yes, Michael? Did you want to say?
Well, I just thought while I was hearing you that thank you for doing this, and it's a very important story. The repeating history by not knowing it. Your voice is very strong for that. Thank you.
That's it? I guess so. Some wine, a seltzer, or water.